The night did not scream. It held its breath. A cold wind pressed against the walls of the city, carrying the smell of wet earth and dying fires. Somewhere in the dark, a bell rang once, then stopped, not because it finished, but because no one was left to pull the rope. This is how kingdoms really fall, not with thunder, but with silence. The man who wore the crown that night believed himself untouchable. Stone walls surrounded him. Oaths protected him. God, he thought, watched from above. He had survived rival lords, broken treaties, whispered betrayals. He had crushed rebellions and outlived stronger men. By every rule of his world, he should have slept peacefully. But history was already walking toward him, barefoot and armed. Inside the city, doors were shut, families huddled close to fading hearths. No one sang, no one drank. Even the dogs had gone quiet, as if they sensed that the night was listening. Fear had a weight to it, heavy, slow, pressing down on the chest. Far beyond the walls, shapes moved through the darkness, not hurried, not loud. Men who had crossed seas did not fear cold or shadow. They had learned patience the hard way, through hunger, loss, and blood soaked into frozen ground. They were not here for gold. They were not here for land. They were here because something sacred had been violated. Years earlier, a man had been denied the one thing his world promised every warrior, a death with meaning. He had been humiliated, stripped not just of life, but of dignity. The act had been meant as a warning. It became a summons. That insult traveled farther than any ship ever could. It crossed water, memory, and bloodlines. It settled into the minds of men who did not forget, men who believed that some debts were too heavy for mercy. And now, that debt had matured. Inside the great hall, the king sat beneath carved beams darkened by smoke and age. The fire before him burned low. Advisors had argued earlier. Some urged caution, others dismissal. In the end, the crown chose pride. Pride always feels reasonable, right before the end. No scout had returned. No messenger had arrived. That should have been the warning. When the first shout finally broke the silence, it was already too late. The gates did not fall with a crash. They opened with a groan. Wood surrendering to hands that knew exactly where to push. Steel whispered. Boots met stone. By the time alarms rang, the streets were already filling with shadows. Not chaos, control. Corners sealed, alleys swallowed, escape routes erased before anyone realized they needed one. The city had been studied, its weaknesses memorized, its routines learned like prayer. This was not a raid. It was a sentence being carried out. Men ran. Some prayed, some froze, trapped between belief and disbelief. The walls they trusted had become corridors. The faith they clung to suddenly felt very far away. In the hall, the king stood at last. He reached for a weapon that felt smaller than it should have. Around him, the air changed, not with noise, but with certainty. He understood then. This was not about conquest. This was not about power. This was about remembrance. Outside, the city burned, not wildly, but deliberately. Fire placed where it would hurt the most, where it would be seen, where it would be remembered. Smoke rose into the night like a signal meant for history itself. The crown was still in the king's head when they came for him. It would not stay there long. Because some nights are not meant to end with sunrise. Some nights exist only to mark a turning. And once they begin, they do not stop until the world is different. The silence returned. Mourning did not bring relief. It brought clarity. The city woke to the truth written in smoke. Streets that once carried merchants and prayers now carried the weight of what had been done in the dark. Doors hung open, walls wept ash. The living stepped carefully, afraid to disturb the dead, afraid to accept that the night had not been a nightmare. And in the center of it all, the crown no longer ruled. The king had been taken, not dragged screaming through the streets, but moved with a purpose that felt worse than violence. He was not a victim of rage. He was evidence. Proof that power could be stripped away quietly, without ceremony, without mercy. They kept him alive on purpose. Outside the city, beyond the reach of broken bells and burned sanctuaries, the army waited. It did not celebrate. There were no drunken songs, no careless laughter. These men did not confuse revenge with joy. They understood that joy fades, memory does not. The captive was brought before those who mattered, not the loudest, not the strongest, the ones who remembered. A man who could not stand watched him closely. His body was twisted by fate, but his mind was sharp enough to cut stone. Where others saw an enemy king, he saw a symbol, a moment in time that demanded balance. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Questions were asked softly, not to gather information, but to reopen wounds. Each word peeled back another layer of certainty the king had once wrapped around himself. The pit, the humiliation, the choice to deny a man dignity because power allowed it. The king tried to speak, tried to justify, tried to remind them of laws and borders. None of it mattered. Some crimes in their world did not belong to courts or treaties. They belonged to memory, and memory demanded a language older than law. The decision was never debated. It had been made long before ships touched the shore, long before the city gates surrendered. What remained was execution, not of a man, but of an idea. That kings were protected, that crowns were sacred, that cruelty could hide behind authority. The place was chosen carefully, high ground, visible, not hidden like the crime that had started it all. This would not be done in secret. It would be done as a message. The ground was cold, the air still. When it began, there was no rush. This was not a killing, it was a transformation. Pain came in stages, deliberate and measured, as if time itself had slowed to witness. The body resisted. The mind broke first. Sound carried across the field in a way prayer never had. Those watching did not turn away. In their belief, endurance mattered, silence mattered. To face death screaming was to leave this world unworthy of honor, and the man on the ground had already surrendered that right. When it was finished, What remained barely resembled a king. It was a warning made of bone and breath, a symbol that would travel faster than any army, faster than any messenger. And it worked. The survivors carried the story south, east, west. They carried it into halls where other rulers slept uneasily, into councils where power suddenly felt fragile. The message was simple and terrifying. There would be no negotiations. There would be no neutrality. There would be no forgetting. Kingdoms began to crack, not from invasion, but from fear. Some fought and vanished. Some prayed and died. Some ran, abandoning thrones that no longer felt worth defending. The army did not slow, because revenge, once satisfied, does not disappear. It changes shape. What began as a debt had become momentum. What began as memory had become destiny. And somewhere beyond the smoke and broken crowns, another ruler watched. Younger, quieter, not yet legendary. He was learning, because the storm that destroys the careless also teaches the patient how to survive. The lands ahead did not resist at first. They listened. Word travels differently after a crown falls. It does not rush. It sinks in. Villages emptied before the army arrived. Gates stayed closed, not in defiance, but in hope. Hope that silence might be mistaken for absence. It never was. Where armies once marched in lines, this one moved like weather. It did not announce itself. It simply arrived, reshaping whatever stood in its path. Fields were taken without battle. Strongholds were surrounded, studied, then starved. Every choice was intentional, every delay calculated. This was no longer vengeance. This was instruction. The men who led it understood something rulers often forget. Fear lasts longer than fire. A city can be rebuilt, a wall repaired, but once doubt enters a kingdom's bones, it never truly leaves. Some kings tried to fight. They gathered levies, farmers holding spears they had never trained with, boys wearing armor that didn't fit. Courage met experience, and experience won quickly. The defeated were not always slaughtered. Sometimes they were spared, sent home with their stories intact. Those stories did the real damage. Other rulers chose submission. Gold was offered, hostages exchanged, promises sworn under sacred symbols. None of it slowed the advance. Mercy was unpredictable, and that made it useless as a strategy. You could not bargain with a force that did not need your survival. Winter came, and the army stayed. They did not return to the sea. They did not drift away like raiders of old. They settled into conquered ground, as if they had always belonged there. Homes were claimed, roads repaired, walls strengthened. The message was unmistakable. This was permanence. The old order began to unravel quietly. Lords argued with priests. Councils fractured. Faith was tested not by words, but by outcomes. Gods who did not intervene began to feel distant. Power, once believed to be divine, now looked fragile, human. In the south, A young man watched all of this unfold from the edge of the storm. He had no legendary strength, no towering reputation. His body betrayed him often, folding under pain that never fully left. But his mind stayed awake. He noticed patterns others missed. He noticed how the invaders avoided certain terrain, how they waited instead of charging, how they forced enemies to exhaust themselves before striking. He noticed that brute force was not their greatest weapon. Patience was. While older rulers clung to pride, he prepared to endure. He learned when to fight and when not to. He understood that survival was not cowardice, it was positioning. The army moved again, pushing deeper, spreading thinner but growing stronger in reputation. They no longer needed to burn every city. Many surrendered at the rumor of approach. Fear arrived ahead of them, clearing the way. But fear has limits. It terrifies the unprepared. It sharpens the prepared. One kingdom remained unconvinced, smaller, more stubborn, held together not by confidence, but by refusal. Its people were tired, its resources strained, but its leaders had learned the cost of arrogance from watching others fall. Instead of charging, they waited. Instead of shouting, they built. What followed would not be a single battle remembered for blood. It would be a long test of will, of adaptation, of whether vengeance could sustain an empire or whether it would collapse under its own weight. Because storms do not last forever, but those who learn from them sometimes do. And the army, unstoppable until now, was about to face something it had not encountered yet, a future that refused to be afraid.
The first defeat did not come with screams. It came with confusion. The army advanced as it always had, measured, deliberate, confident in the gravity of its own name. Towns ahead were meant to yield, roads were meant to clear. Fear was supposed to arrive first and do the work. But this time, the roads stayed occupied, the towns stayed watchful, the people did not run. They did not stand bravely either. They did something far more dangerous. They adapted. The southern kingdom did not meet the invaders in open fields where numbers decided fate. It refused the kind of battles songs are written about. Instead, it withdrew, quietly, patiently. Villages emptied just before arrival, leaving behind no food, no shelter, no panic, only distance. Supply lines stretched thin. Scouts returned with less certainty. The land itself began to resist, not with walls, but with absence. Hunger crept in slowly, unnoticed at first, then impossible to ignore. The young king watched from the shadows of marsh and forest. He did not chase glory, he chased time. He had learned something the North had not. Conquest burns energy, but defense can hoard it. While the army marched, he fortified. While they demanded submission, he studied their habits, their timing, their overconfidence. Then winter returned. Not the kind that kills quickly, but the kind that weakens. Rain turned roads into traps. Marshes swallowed horses. Small skirmishes bled strength without offering satisfaction. Every step forward cost more than the last. Still, the army pushed on, because retreat felt impossible. Too much had been taken, too much blood spent, too many crowns broken. But vengeance, once fulfilled, offers no direction. It does not tell you where to go next. It only tells you where you came from. The Southern king waited until the moment doubt outweighed fear. Then he struck, not with one battle, but with many small ones, night attacks, ambushes, retreats that lured pursuit into mud and water and confusion, victories that meant nothing on their own, but everything together. For the first time, the army felt watched, not feared. Watched. The realization spread quietly through the ranks. This enemy was not reckless. He did not panic. He learned, and worse, he endured. When the decisive clash finally came, it was not where anyone expected. It was not clean. It was not heroic. It was exhaustion meeting preparation. The army fought as it always had. The kingdom fought as it had learned to. And that difference mattered. The outcome was not annihilation. It was interruption. The unstoppable force did not collapse, but it stalled. Momentum fractured. Confidence cracked. For the first time since the debt was paid, the future felt uncertain. The young king did not celebrate. He knew better. He had not won the war. He had only survived it. But survival was enough. Because once fear loses its certainty, it is never the same again. And somewhere far from the battlefield, the mind that had designed the storm was no longer there to guide it. Empires do not collapse when they are defeated. They collapse when they forget why they exist. The army was still vast, still feared, still capable of tearing cities apart. But something invisible had changed. The center no longer held. The purpose that once pulled every blade in the same direction had thinned, stretched, faded. Revenge had been a fire. Now it was ash. The man whose mind once bound strategy to cruelty was gone. Some said illness took him. Others whispered that the gods reclaimed what never truly belonged to them. Whatever the truth, the absence was undeniable. Orders lost precision. Decisions lost patience. The army split, not violently, but inevitably. Some wanted land. Some wanted legacy. Some wanted to go home carrying stories heavy enough to last a lifetime. The unity forged by outrage could not survive success. They settled. What had begun as invasion became occupation. Warriors became rulers. Camps turned into towns. Axes were traded for plows, shields for boundaries. The conquerors learned the language of the conquered, took their customs, married into their bloodlines. And slowly, without ceremony, the storm became weather. The Southern king watched this transformation carefully. He did not rush to reclaim everything. He did not chase enemies already dissolving. Instead, he strengthened what remained his. Walls rose where none had stood before. Ships were built where only fishing boats had existed. Messengers moved faster than armies ever had. He prepared not for yesterday's enemy, but for tomorrow's. Because the greatest mistake after survival is assuming danger has passed. Years moved forward. The land remembered what it had endured. Burned fields regrown, rebuilt towns marked by scars that never fully vanished.
Stories became warnings. Names once spoken with terror turned into lessons for children not yet born. The invaders did not disappear. They changed the land permanently. Laws shifted, words blended, bloodlines merged. The world that existed before the storm never returned. And yet, neither did the storm. One day, far from the marshes and quiet fortresses, a burial mound was opened. What lay inside mattered less than what it represented, a belief that some power still guarded the land, that conquest itself could be restrained by memory. When the mound was disturbed, nothing dramatic happened. No thunder, no curse spoken aloud, but belief moved. Soon after, sails appeared on the horizon once more. Different banners, different language, the same hunger. History had turned another page. By then, the southern kingdom was ready, not because it was stronger than all others, but because it remembered. It remembered fear and learned from it. It remembered loss and adapted. It remembered silence and filled it with preparation. The revenge that once reshaped the world had done its work. It had destroyed the old balance, but it had also taught those who survived how to build something harder to break. When the next invaders came, they would not face scattered kings arguing over pride. They would face a land that had already been broken once and refused to be broken again. The storm had passed, but its shadow ensured the future would never be careless. Long after the last campfire faded, the land still remembered, not as dates, not as victories, but as absences, empty thrones, silent halls, fields where names were no longer spoken because saying them hurt too much. The fire had moved on, but it had changed the shape of everything it touched. The men who came for revenge did not leave as monsters in the stories of those who survived. They became ancestors, lawmakers, traitors, ghosts woven into the language of the land itself. Their violence ended, but its consequences never did. That is the lie history often tells, that endings are clean. They are not. The Southern Kingdom endured, not because it was chosen, but because it learned. It learned that strength without patience shatters, that fear can conquer quickly, but it cannot govern forever, that survival is not passive, it is engineered. Walls rose where memory demanded them. Ships patrolled waters once left open. Power became quieter, slower, less theatrical. And that restraint, born from near annihilation, outlasted every blade. The old enemies did not vanish. They dissolved into the land. Their gods faded. Their words remained. Their bloodlines carried on, unremarkable, human. This is how empires truly end, not with collapse, with absorption. What began as a debt of blood reshaped a world, then disappeared into it. The names that once froze kingdoms became echoes. The terror that once arrived ahead of ships became lessons whispered to children. And somewhere beneath the soil, bones rested that had once believed they could command fate itself. History remembers the fire, but the future belongs to what survives it. Because the greatest legacy of vengeance is not destruction, it is transformation. And the world that emerged from the ashes was not safer, only wiser. The silence did not return. It evolved.